Right, this is the M26. It's known as the Pershing, named rather obviously after Black Jack Pershing, who commanded the American Expeditionary Force in France in the First World War. So it was one of the first tanks the Americans chose a name for themselves, rather than taking an English one like the Sherman and adapting it to their own purposes. But that's the basic tank. Now, in fact, an M26 is an M46, but with the original engine in. This is the tank as built, as distinct from the M46, which is the tank upgraded with a new engine for operating in Korea and that sort of thing. So this is the first tank of this type that was built. It was classed as a heavy tank, which is really a bit of an anomaly. It weighs about 42 tons, and really that's not heavy by any standards, but it was a big tank by American standards. It also suffered in a way from the American attitude that the men at the front, the men in the tanks, the men actually doing the fighting, were asking for a more powerful gun and thicker armour, but by the time their message had got across the Atlantic to the generals in charge, I'm thinking of General Leslie McNair, who was in charge of American military procurement for the army, and Gladian Barnes, who was in charge of tank development, it had really rather watered down. Both of those generals, harking back a bit to the First World War, saw their role as producing a few more reliable tanks for the American army, rather than these new exotic ones. So that McNair particularly didn't like the M26 and reckoned the Sherman would do. He'd been told the Sherman was winning the war and they didn't need anything else. Gladian Barnes liked the M26 and wanted to push it a bit and hurried it into production. There was a bit of antagonism over there, and a very strong difference between the personnel at the front and the personnel working back home to make the tank the thing it was. Now, the M26 is basically a cast tank, as you can see, large castings at the front and the turret. It's armed with the 90mm M3 gun, which has got a fairly powerful punch, but it really wasn't that far ahead. It didn't equal the long 88 in the Tiger II, for instance. American experts reckoned this tank was better than the Tiger. Well, it ought to have been. The Tiger was quite old by comparison, and about equal to the Panther, which isn't saying very much, and definitely inferior to the Tiger II. Luckily, there weren't many of them about, but that was the sort of level it's deemed to be working at. This is basically the T26E3, which was standardized as the M26. It's got a 30 caliber machine gun in the front of the hull and another one coaxially mounted next to the main armament, and it's got a 50 caliber gun on top for the commander. That was usually designed to shoot down aeroplanes, but more often than not was used against ground targets. The driver sits here on the left. Next to him, the co-driver who works this thing, which is known as a lap gun. He also has a set of steering controls of his own to work. The tank has torsion bar suspension. Now, torsion bar suspension is still relatively new. It had already appeared on 2 or 3 tanks, on the M18 Hellcat, for instance, on the M24 Chaffee, but this was the first heavy tank which featured torsion bar suspension, although many of its predecessors, which were mainly experimental tanks, had earlier kinds of suspension, and they were really still making up their minds as to which it needed. Now, the real problem with Pershing was the power pack. It had in the back the Ford V8 engine, the model GAF, in fact. And although it produced about 500 horsepower, it was a little bit sluggish for this tank, and it meant that the tank didn't have its full power potential. That came out more in Korea than in Europe anyway. But the top road speed was about 25 miles an hour. You could get 35 or 30 out of it at a pinch, but only for a short time. 25 was what it was designed to do. So it has that arrangement in the back. That drives to a Torque-O-Matic 3-speed transmission, which is near enough an automatic transmission, and that's in the back. This tank also has rear drive sprockets. Now, that's unusual for an American tank. By this time, most tanks still had front drive sprockets. And the Americans had finally moved it to the back, rather as the British had always done, and they had an arrangement of the engine, gearbox and final drive all together at the back of the tank. Now, that's fine in that it doesn't clutter up the middle of the tank with a shaft drive running from the back to the front, which is a running nuisance at the best of times, but it does mean that the driver has a more difficult job, at least in hearing the movements of the power of the engine and the gearbox in relation to it. So it is a little bit more tricky to drive, but it's still a better bet than many of the tanks that had gone before it. Now, the Pershing went over to France for the first time in January 1945, and a few were used by an organisation known as the Zebra Mission, under the eye of Gladian Barnes, who'd also went over to France to Northwest Europe to see how they worked. And it did do pretty well. It had some of these tanks have an extremely good record of knocking out Tigers and Panthers and this sort of thing. But in the main, they were just another tank. And that gun, although it's quite good, isn't as good. At least it's not really as good as the British 17-pounder in some respects. Probably more accurate. Most guns would be. But the 17-pounder, if it hit, did a lot of damage. And that took a while to develop in these 90mm guns. They really needed something bigger. And they'd already tried 105s. But that's the basic tank, the M26. And it really is a new generation of American tank. Rather like one of the first of the new post-war tanks that the Americans produced, ending with the M60, using the same casting, but really with an upgraded engine, which the tank was crying out for. It was underpowered for its day.